welcome. We're so excited to have you all here today. So my name is Nasreen, and I'm the Education Program Manager here at the Commonwealth Club. My role for today is to speak as little as possible and have our Youth Advisory Committee members shine, as this was entirely led by them from the beginning. So just a bit more context. In the fall, we led a youth agenda survey. And so with that survey, students voted all across California on the issues that they thought were most important in society. And those three were mental health, climate change, and reproductive rights. And so today we have an amazing lineup of speakers, breakout rooms based on those issues, and this entire conference is led by our Youth Advisory Committee. And so, Youth Advisory Committee members, I know the room is dark, but please stand up. Please give a great shout out to them. All right, so just a quick overview of the evening today. The morning today. We will do, as you guys are all here, we did sign in, brief introductory remarks. We will have our fabulous keynote speakers come on stage, and then we'll do a Q&A with our keynote speakers. From there, we'll have a short break, and then we will do breakout rooms. And so based on the color of your name tag, climate change will be in here. Our reproductive rights room will be downstairs on the first floor, and then for mental health, that will be on the third floor. And so feel free to take the elevators to that room. And then for our adults in the room, we'll be having an area for you guys near the library, also on the first floor with some coffee and tea. And then at around 12 to 1, we'll have lunch and then an action lounge. And so we have a few organizations here that do youth empowerment work, also work on climate change, mental health and reproductive rights that will be tabling outside for you guys to kind of get to know their work. We'll also have voter registration for any students who want to pre-register to vote as well. From there, we'll come back to Toby, and then this is Toby Auditorium, and then we'll do a interactive debrief session, and then from there we'll have just a brief feedback and wrap up for the evening. I keep saying evening, I'm sorry. We usually do evening programs, and so in my mind I'm like, evening, no, this is the morning. And that is our schedule for today. And so everyone should have gotten a flyer for the agenda for today. If you have any questions, feel free to find anyone with a Commonwealth Club name tag or the Youth Advisory Committee t-shirts and name tags as well. And without further ado, I'm going to have Angela introduce our keynote speakers for today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Nasreen, for that conference overview. My name is Angela, and I'm a current 10th grader at Basis Independent Fremont. I'm very heavily involved in a lot of my school's activities. I have the honor of being the president of our Model UN Club, vice president of communications for our DECA chapter, and captain of the Quiz Bowl team. So, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about learning, whether it be about biology, business, history, world affairs, politics, or geography. So today, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speakers, and I'm so excited for what they have to share with us. They bring a wealth of knowledge and experience, and I know we're all going to learn a lot from them. So at the end of this session, we'll set aside the last 10 minutes for a Q&A, so be sure to jot down any questions that you have that come to mind during their talk. So our keynote speakers for today are Chris Badillo and Brianna Mullen. So Chris Badillo is Education Justice Academy's policy director and a committed education justice advocate. Originally from Miami, Florida, Chris's experiences in Miami-Dade County public schools instilled him with a passion for ensuring all communities, especially working communities and communities of color like his, are afforded the high-quality public education that they deserve. He began organizing as a sophomore in high school following the Parkland shooting in 2018, focusing on bringing the voices of young people to the policymaking table. From there, he became deeply involved and invested in school board governance, being elected Miami-Dade's student advisor to the school board. He then went on to serve as a policy and outreach lead for the Luisa Santos School Board, District 9 campaign working to expand equity-oriented leadership on the board. Following the election, he served as administrative assistant to the school board member Luisa Santos, working on policies and programs to better support Miami's various communities. In his time in the office, he supported the creation of a student fellowship within the office to expose young people to the school board and worked on items focusing on post-secondary access for undocumented students and renewable energy. Chris served as the program director for EJA's first two cohorts, now focuses on expanding EJA's reach and community, developing a community of practice and education justice issues. In his free time, Chris enjoys constantly consuming coffee, cooking Nicaraguan food, and being with his 3 dogs. If we can all have a round of applause for him. And our second keynote speaker, Brianna Mullen, has worked as a state policymaker, community organizer, and educational advocate for the past 15 years to ensure the most vulnerable children have access to liberatory education and healthy communities. Raised in the Bay Area, she is a first-generation college student and has master's degrees in policy, organization, and leadership studies at Stanford Graduate School of Education and in public policy from the Stanford School of Humanities and Sciences. She is a 2020 Knight Hennessy Scholar and was selected as the first ever Stanford Global Impact Award winner in 2023. She graduated from University of California, Berkeley, where she studied history, education, and city planning. And she has served as a board member for the Sacramento Children's Commission, Torkelson Whole Child Institute, and Associated Students of the University of California. She is currently the co-founder and executive director of the Education Justice Academy, which seeks to support school governance leaders in transformative education justice initiatives. So let's give a warm welcome to our keynote speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Angela. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Angela, for making your way through 2 very long bios. And, I think one thing to say is, I've really only been doing this for a little while. So just to show you how much you can do when you start young. I want to say this is exactly the kind of room that gives me hope right now. Young people are choosing to come together at this time, not just to talk about what's wrong, but to act and to demand better on climate change, on reproductive rights, on civil rights, on things that cross-cut all of our communities today. You all haven't been waited to be asked, you just have started building, and I want to encourage you in this speech to keep that momentum forward. The instinct to build a new world, the world that you would actually like to live in and grow up in, is a magical thing that I think too many young people lose as they progress in their careers. As Andrew said, I'm Brianna Mullen. I'm the co-founder of the Education Justice Academy, and I started my career as a youth organizer. I can no longer say that I'm a youth organizer because I use prescription skincare, and so I've decided that kind of is the end of my youth organizer career, but I get to work with amazing youth organizers. And the truth is, I started organizing because I was angry. I was 16 years old. I was a student in public high school in the Bay Area during the recession in 2008. And that year, a third of my teachers were pink-slipped, meaning they may not have jobs in the fall. At the time, my parents were struggling with addiction. They had both lost their jobs during the recession, and I was helping take care of my 5 siblings. The 2 youngest were just twins and were 3 years old. And we were also being evicted. And so school was my only safe place. And when I thought about losing a third of my teachers the next year, people who saw me and valued me and knew that I wanted to change the world and encouraged me to do so, I was terrified. And the first thing they tried to cut was elementary school music, the very program that I felt had helped raise me. I remember sitting in the back of a school board meeting doing my pre-calc homework, waiting hours for public comment. And when I approached the podium, I shared my heartbreak at the thought that the district would cut the program that I hoped would provide refuge to my younger siblings like it had for me. And you know what the poor school board president told me after my public comment? She told me that I didn't know what I was talking about. And if I cared, then I really had to go to Sacramento and talk to Governor Schwarzenegger at the time. We called him the Gouverneur. And I did. I kind of took her advice maybe a little too seriously. I went to Berkeley for undergrad. I ran and won in student government. I ran a $250 million construction project when I was 19. I became a policy advisor to a constitutional officer at 23. And I spent the next decade learning everything I could about school boards. And then, Years later, when my classmate became the new music director at the high school, I was band president and he was drum major, so it was like a fun thing to see him come full circle. I came back to that same gym auditorium with the terrible fluorescent lights, and I told her that she had told me that I had to go to Sacramento, and I went. But I had never needed to work in Sacramento to get fancy Stanford degrees or hold prestigious titles to know that cutting arts education from vulnerable kids was the wrong thing to do. I already knew that at 16. I didn't need to go do all that work to know that. And just like many of you already know what is right and what is broken and what needs to change. Young people are so often dismissed. You're told to wait your turn to get to the right title, the right degree, the right years of experience. You might be told that you act older than your age. I know I was constantly told that I was 13 going on 30, as if it was a compliment. But let me tell you something that I know for sure now. Youth is not a liability. It is a superpower. You can say more, you can risk more than almost anyone else in the room. You still believe the world should live up to the values it preaches, and you're brave enough to point out the gap when it doesn't. At just 13, Mary Beth Tinker helped spark a landmark Supreme Court case after she and 5 other students were suspended for wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War and the bombings of 6 black little girls by the Ku Klux Klan in Montgomery, Alabama. After petitioning all the way to the highest court in our country, you know what they said? They said that students don't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate, affirming the First Amendment right of young people in their public schools. Up to that point, they didn't have that until 1973. Students didn't have the right to have free speech in school. And I think that Mary Beth is a story that I like to share because she has spent her life since then fighting for young people's rights and reminding us that students can and should and often already are speaking up for justice and being ignored. And when asked why she took that risk, Mary Beth said, "I could say more and risk less than my parents. I didn't have to put food on the table or walk a careful line. I could just speak the truth." And that's why so many of you are here today. You are holding up a mirror to our society and asking, do you really believe what you say you believe? If mental health matters, why are schools underfunded and counselors overworked? If reproductive rights matter, why do I have less rights today than when I was 16? If climate change is real, why are we failing to take action day after day? The mirror you're holding up is uncomfortable for some people, but necessary, because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is to tell the truth, loudly, unapologetically, and together. At EJA, we teach students how to understand power, not just the power to protest, but the power to govern. In a minute, you're going to hear from my amazing colleague, Chris Badillo, and his story of learning how to build power, govern, and hold his own school district accountable. When I met Chris at a weekend workshop over 4 years ago, I immediately knew I had found a kindred spirit as another youth organizer. Chris then became the first person I hired to teach at EJA, where he taught people 3 times his age how to govern their own school district and make change. And I hired Chris because I knew Chris saw what we could and had to do in order for students to have a better education, not some distant time in the future, but today. And that's what youth power looks like. It's not hypothetical, it's happening right now. And I want to leave you with this. I don't want anyone to tell you that you're not ready. If the world feels broken, it's not because you did anything. It's because adults got comfortable with compromise. And now it is your turn to lead. Not someday, but today. Because the truth is, the world can't wait, and neither can we. Thank you. I'm gonna let Chris speak.
Thank you, Brianna. As she said, I'm Chris Badillo, and I'm the Policy Director for Education Justice Academy, and I'm truly so honored to be with you all today. It's, like Brianna said, rooms like these that give me hope. Just seeing the energy that you're bringing here, your presence really speaks to the power that young people have when we come together. What Brianna didn't tell you about that weekend workshop 4 years ago is that I walked into the room with a deep sense of uncertainty. I'd only been in California at that point for a couple of months, and my approach to building community could best be described as kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall. I was just trying to see what would stick. But even with that, I walked into this tan square room that had a whole bunch of Post-it papers stuck all along the walls, and I started going through activities. We talked about what it meant to lead, what it meant to build relationships, what it meant to be an organizer. Our first task is to host a one-on-one with someone. And Brianna and I, by some swing of fate, are paired together. And we don't jump to our job title, the line items on our resume, or what our most recent LinkedIn post it was. We talk about our values, our stories, and where we came from. We talk about our hope. And in a very real sense, in that moment, I remember why I became an organizer, why I had come to California in the first place. I grew up in Miami, Florida, and I really found organizing, I feel, in the moment that I needed it most. I had honestly lost connection with other students by middle school. I remember my first day, my mom and I had woken up at 6 a.m. to drive across the county and be there at school by 9 because this was supposed to be one of the best schools in my county. And we drive up, and the first thing that we're greeted with is a PTA donation slip through our car window. The starting suggested donation had 3 digits, and I was shocked. The idea of even having disposable income wasn't something that was really within my frame of reference. And that sense of difference slowly but surely set in. I turned inwards. I'm a talker, and I found myself eating lunch alone in 6th grade, and then in 7th, and then into high school. But then it's February of my sophomore year, and I find myself wrapped in my covers in bed, motionless. It's been a few hours since a school shooting happened in Parkland, only around 40 minutes from my home, and I watched as messages flowed in from folks I knew across the school who shared that their friends and family attended Parkland. Scrolling endlessly through Facebook and change.org, I felt outraged. Directionless, I started to write, spewing out all of my anger and sadness and all of the fear that I felt. Apprehensively, I open WhatsApp and I type a message to my debate group chat. I send them a petition that I had wrote, and I ask them to join me in organizing a response at our school to the shooting. I watch nervously as students respond, and we begin to discuss our frustrations, our anger, and what we could do before creating a school-wide group chat of students searching for a response. Over the next few days, I begin to gather names in support of a walkout. And then I receive a message on my phone from a student I knew. He tells me that a walkout violated school rules and that everyone was at risk of retaliation from administration. But staring at that message, imagining every conceivable way that my principal could punish me, I felt an odd sense of determination. If we weren't going to stand up now, when would we? I draft follow-up messages to every single student who had signed up to walk out, warning everyone that we may be punished for walking out, offering them the option to remove their name from the list of students and from the demand. And yet, most of my peers stand strong. We would walk out no matter what. Now, a couple days later, we find ourselves walking through the school with orange armbands, much in the mold of Mary Beth Tinker. And in organizing, I find opportunities for connection I didn't even know were possible. I find people who are willing to stand up for change. As young people, we are so used to being told to wait. We are told we are too young, too naive, too hopeful. My favorite was always just wait until you pay taxes, as if, the climate stops warming as soon as you file with the IRS. And whenever it was time for change in my community, it was always young people at the table pushing us forward. When I graduated high school, I got a job working for a school board member. And through organizing, I had become student advisor to the school board. And honestly, I could not understand how so many people could be elected to represent students, but never bring up inequality, climate change, reproductive rights, or take massive steps forward on mental health education. So when I started working in the office, we made it a mission to actually bring students in to make and write policy. one of the biggest concerns was climate change and renewable energy. We lived in Miami, right on the coast, and students were worried about what our futures would look like. The students we worked with made a choice. They got engaged, they started working with our office, and they chose to fight for their futures. They drafted a policy item to commit our district to clean and renewable energy by 2030. And that became an item that our office introduced and submitted to the board, and it passed unanimously because students showed up, they wrote policy, and they spoke up at the school board meeting. Now, Miami-Dade County Public Schools has a chief sustainability officer who is driving the district forward towards a sustainable future. That is the narrative we write as young people. When change is needed, we choose to embrace it. When we can choose to be anywhere else, we are in rooms like these at 9 o'clock, at 10 o'clock in the morning. We are facing no shortage of challenges. Climate change is causing devastating natural disasters, and it's making it more difficult for so many of our families to afford to live. Reproductive rights have been rolled back, and so many students are sitting in classrooms without the mental health supports that we need to be full and thriving people. And I'll be honest with y'all, I wake up with a sense of uncertainty. But when I walk into rooms like these, it's a reminder that it doesn't have to be this way. And when all is said and done, it's young people who will do the work of addressing young people's challenges. I saw students do it in Miami, and you all are proof that it can happen anywhere. There is so much hope in this room. So I'm gonna ask you to hold your uncertainty, your fear, your anger, the same emotions I feel so often, and just look around at one another. Remember our power. Then choose to do something about the uncertainty. If you can join an effort, we need you to join. If you can run for something, we need you to run. And if you can organize, we need you to organize. I've taken a look at the schedule, and you will have so many opportunities to meet one another and dive deep into the challenges that are facing young people. So I want you all to make a commitment to yourselves, to one another. By the end of today, commit to talking to just 5 people you didn't already know when you came into the room. And I want you to ask them not just about the things that they're doing, but why they do them. Ask each other why you're here. Because 5 people can become a team, and a team becomes action, and action becomes a movement. And that's what I see when I look at you all today, the sparks of a movement, and all we have to do is choose to ignite it. Thank you.
So I think we have some time for questions, and I'll ask Angela to maybe help me out in how we want to do this next step.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for the speeches. They're very empowering. And if you guys want to learn more about them, Tinker versus Des Moines, by the way, is a very, very important Supreme Court case. So yeah, if you guys want to do some extra research. So for the Q&A, I think we're just going to hand around the microphone to whoever has any questions. So, okay, any questions?
Do you have any advice on how to get started in this if you don't really know where to go to get involved?
Yeah, I think that often we, my number one interaction, I always encourage people to start not small, but just local, right? So I would encourage you to go look who your school board members are and just take a look at their ages, their race, how long have they been there? When was the last time they met with a student? Is there a student board member on your board? California has a state law that requires that students, that high schools now have a student board member, and that board member is given preferential voting rights and access to all the materials. I find constantly that most school districts are not actually following the law when it comes to this and not giving high school board members the power that they really deserve. And when you get somebody like Chris as a student board member, that can be huge. They can completely shift the direction of the district. I think it's really about finding somebody local that you like, right? Who are the people who are doing something in your community that you're actually excited about? It might be a city council member. It might be a housing commission. In Palo Alto, there is a small group of students who have been fighting to get affordable housing in Palo Alto for years. And they're the people showing up to the housing commission board and talking about the fact that, there's no housing for them to stay and live in the community that they want to grow up in, that they live in right now. And so, city and local commissions are really great places to start. A lot of cities and counties have local youth commissions that you can start in on. I sat on a children's commission that, also had youth board members on it. And there was like half the seats open almost all the time, right? Because it is hard for, people who have jobs to commit to these things. But it's really important to find somebody who believes in you, because I think Chris and I both found people early in our careers who did not see us as just young people, right? They saw us as the potential that we could become, and they gave us the runway to do that.
Yeah, 100%. When I was getting started at the school board, it was mentioned that I worked for the school board member at Miami-Dade, Luisa Santos, and she told me, like, students can do anything. You just need to give them the space to do it. And she had that trust in me. I think the first step is usually the scariest. You got to just start talking to people. There's like a lot happening in the news. There are a lot of issues. Like I said, there's like a million things that you could challenge, but start with people. Like, what do the folks in your school care about? What do the folks around you care about? What are the issues that you're seeing in your community? And just talk and learn about one another's stories. And eventually, with good organizing and relationships, that becomes the kind of intersection, the snowflake that you're gonna need to get started. So don't kind of psych yourself out about, wow, there are so many challenges. Start with the people around you, and I'm sure you're gonna find some points of connection to get your foot in the door. Okay.
Hi.
Where's your name? Where are you from?
My name's Will. I'm from Woodside. There's for like global warming, for instance, there's so much pushback from the government and from people and corporations saying, oh, global warming's not real, global warming doesn't exist. But then there's also just defeatists who are saying, like, there's nothing we can do, it's gonna destroy the world, it's hopeless. How do we push back against that? Like, how do we push back against such overwhelming, impossible odds that are telling the world, this isn't real, this is fear-mongering, this is fake news? What do we do about that?
Most of the time when people are either fear-mongering or unwilling to look at the truth, it's because they're scared. They're scared. They don't know what to do. They think they're supposed to have the answers. They're an adult who doesn't really know what's going on. You know more, probably, than they do around a lot of these issues. And I think that it's hard. It's hard when you find yourself in rooms where people don't want to listen. And if you find yourself in a room where people are absolutely not willing to listen, it's not a good use of your energy. You should be spending time building power with people who are willing to listen, right? And that is sometimes hard. I still struggle with that. I still, just yesterday, found myself in a place where I did not feel valued and my voice was not being listened to. And I have all these fancy degrees and all this experience, and all this knowledge and all this stuff, and they still didn't want to listen to me. And that makes me realize that they will never listen. And so I just have to not leave them behind, but build something for them that I know that they will appreciate, even if they can't recognize it right now.
Yeah, I think the flip end, when you're thinking about hope and like this sense of defeatism, I mean, it's so easy to find ourselves in that. And it's also easy to think that hope is really naive, right? When you see so much challenge, how are you supposed to think that tomorrow could be better? And I try to like take a step back and think of like, why do we hope and what is hope? The term that we use in organizing is that hope is not about necessarily this fantasy. Hope is just about there being a chance that tomorrow could be better, right? It's just about the chance, right? It's, sometimes Goliath wins, a lot of the time Goliath wins, but sometimes David wins, right? And it's that sometimes that we need to operate in to continue to hope, to continue to move ourselves forward. And I think the practice of being people and building relationships is showing one another that, hey, in the face of so much, we can come together and we can make choices. We can have agency. We look at these kind of structures of power. There are people in government, like you said, who seem completely opposed to the things that we need to do to make our society better. And while those power structures might exist, that's not the only place power sits. Power sits in this room. It sits with all of us once we start talking with one another, once we start organizing. And the process of building hope is also the process of building those relationships and bringing us together.
Do you have, this is probably similar to the last two questions, but do you have any advice, for people who want to, organize a movement of young people? Because I think it can feel pretty overwhelming, even if you've identified, an issue, what do you do from there? And I guess, in addition to that, what do you do when you feel like the people around you don't care or they don't want to make a difference?
Yeah. The tangible steps, how do you take the first steps forward? We try to think, especially in the work that we do at Education Justice Academy, how do we take these big shared purposes, these big things that we want to see changed in the world, and we chunk them down. So we want to see education justice, and then we identify a place where we want to see education justice, and then we identify what education justice looks like, right? So it's how do we make these really big problems manageable? And part of that process is really getting in a room and starting to say, okay, where have we seen the manifestations of this issue? Where have we seen this problem come up for us? And how do we explain, A, why it showed up, and B, what it's going to take to fix it, right? Who's the decision maker? If there is no decision maker, what do we need to do together to kind of shift this dynamic, right? And I think these are all conversations that we kind of intuitively understand. So even if you don't have an organizing framework, you don't have the tools, the best place is just to start thinking about, what am I seeing? Because you really are the expert when it comes to the issues that you're experiencing. And that kind of chunking can make it feel more manageable.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that, if you're really overwhelmed, the easiest thing to do is just look around your school, what's something you want changed? What's something that needs to be changed in your schools that the adults are not changing? And then find one other person who agrees with you, two other people that agree with you, three other, it starts with a one-on-one. The one-on-one conversations are the building blocks for how you make change, take change. And it can come down to sometimes realizing that only the people that you get on your side and frankly all agree that they want to take action, right? You have to move at the pace that you have relationships as, and that's sometimes hard. I formed this big organization 5 years ago. I was like, let's do it. Come on, guys, let's do it. And everybody's like, school boards? I don't know. That doesn't really seem that interesting. And then Moms for Liberty popped up, and then people were like, oh, maybe school boards are kind of important, right? And it took years and years and years for people to see what we were doing as valuable. And Chris and I were just joking that it's sometimes it's frustrating. It's frustrating to be like, oh my gosh, I was saying this for so long and people weren't listening. But saying it out loud for yourself can matter, and it can help your own mental health to just say, hey, this bothers me and I'm not okay with it. And then maybe by saying it out loud, you find somebody else who agrees with you.
I think a lot of what was said was really important, especially because one thing that you can start with if you're facing a lot of opposition, a lot of that comes from shared core values. For example, if you see someone, on the opposite side of the political spectrum, they might just agree just on the basis that they want to see the world be a better place. So that's something that you can start with if you want to see change, and if you just want to have a discussion, learn more about the other side and potentially convince them about your cause.
Yeah, just a quick note, so often we use categories and labels to separate one another, and we say oh, I identify with this and therefore we can't work together. But so often if you just have a conversation about your values, you can find connection with one another.
Okay, so we're gonna take one more question.
Hi, my name is Juno. I come from Mountain View, California. And basically I'm a transgender citizen, and it can be, for my entire life, I was able to stay strong and be yeah, I am transgender, and there is nothing wrong with that. But I just figured out recently that, like, one of the people that I was closest to, my own family, they told me how, like, they didn't think that there should be a female to be president. And this is also a woman. This is a woman who told me that a woman can't be president. And that's when I started to realize that, like, when I started to look around a lot more, like, I even knew that another one of my family members, like, voted for someone who was quite violent. And they knew I'm transgender. So it's like, how do you stay strong? And, like, that's when I started to break. It's like, how do you stay strong and, like, true to yourself when people who are the closest to you by blood are going and basically not having your best interest at heart?
Yeah, I have a trans sibling in Arkansas, rural public schools, and my family has not been supportive, and they have also voted for very violent people, and I am sorry because I have seen that pain very firsthand. And there's lots of other queer and trans students in their school who have, honestly, like, worse circumstances, like very unsafe circumstances that they're living in. And I think the way that I stay strong is by seeing them stay strong, you know? Like, Chris and I are working very closely with students who are organizing in Southern California in schools where they are banning pride flags and outing students and doing really awful things. And yet I have met some of the most incredible young people who are taking themselves out of environments where they're not supported and finding environments where they are. And I don't know what that looks like for all of you, but I guarantee you there's gonna be rooms, and sometimes it's gonna be family by blood, and sometimes it's gonna be workplaces, and sometimes it's gonna be classrooms, and sometimes it's just gonna be a restaurant where suddenly you realize that you're not safe for some reason. And I would just encourage you to acknowledge that feeling, to hold it, and to know that you deserve to find community where you are safe. And when you are safe enough in your community, you have to go out and then create more safety for other people. That's the responsibility we have. If you feel safe right now, you have to make more safety for other people. If you don't feel safe right now, you have to protect yourself so that you can then do that later, right? And so all of that is very different for us as individuals. My sibling in Arkansas, you know, I'm always worried about them. They have bright pink and purple hair and piercings and are visibly trans, walking down the street in a rural town where there is an active KKK chapter. And I think that I'm worried all the time. And yet I see them become this strong person because they know that who they are is not wrong. And they know who they are is powerful and brave and loving and caring. And if you know that about yourself, you can be in some really difficult circumstances and still survive. And I know I have done that. But you have to find the place where you are valued eventually, because that's where you find your power, is when you surround yourself with people who believe in you and can see you and don't tell you that you have to wait. So I know that there's a lot that probably we didn't have the chance to address, and I know you all are gonna have amazing breakout sessions. So we're happy to talk at noon at the tabling for anybody else. Thank you guys so much.
Hi guys, thank you all so much for coming out today. Excited to see so many of you youth audience members out here. So my name is Mina Fedor. I'm a junior at College Prep High School in Oakland, and I'm also a member of the Commonwealth Youth Advisory Committee. And I'm excited to be emceeing this panel with our lovely panelists and climate activists here today. So a bit about the agenda for this breakout session. We're gonna start off with an icebreaker activity and then head into Q&A with about 15 minutes left for all of you audience members to ask any questions that you have of our lovely panelists here. So now a bit more about our panelists. First, we have Jun Choi, who is a PhD candidate in Earth System Science at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, where her research focuses on quantifying climate change impacts to inform adaptation strategies. At Stanford, she has been a lead organizer for the Coalition of True School of Sustainability and a founding member of the student group Scholars Promoting Academic Responsibility. For the past 3 years, she has served as a teaching fellow for the Leadership, Organizing, and Action program, as a coach for Public Narrative, a framework developed by Marshall Gans, previously at Climate Policy Initiative and the Climate Bonds Initiative. She contributed to mobilizing climate finance for mitigation and adaptation projects, and she holds an MA in International Relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a BA in Sociology from Amherst College. Yeah, so glad to have you here. And this is Finn Does. He is an organizer, environmental educator, and student at UC Berkeley. With over 5 years of climate justice leadership, he first became involved in organizing at the age of 15 after experiencing a Bay Area shrouded in smoke. And since then, Finn has driven numerous youth-led initiatives aimed at preparing communities across America for climate disasters. He co-chaired the Bay Area Youth Climate Summit, empowering more than 9,000 California youth for over 230 high schoolers through more than 100 workshops focused on climate literacy. Finn currently co-leads institutional research cohort exploring how intersectionality influences youth climate, emotions, and activism. And he lectures for the award-winning Solutions for a Sustainable and Just Future course at UC Berkeley. Additionally, Finn speaks nationally on climate communications and organizes with Sunrise Bay Area, and his work has earned him collaborations with PBS, KQED's Advisory Board, and the California Academy of Sciences and Stanford, and he's been featured in outlets such as Newsweek, KQED, ABC News, and the UN. So super excited to have you both here. So first we will start off, I guess, with our icebreaker activity, also so that you all audience members get a chance to talk to each other and talk to each other a bit about climate change as well. So I guess now we'll get into a bit more of the prepared Q&A for our panelists. So I'll start off with some intro questions just to hear a bit more about your personal climate advocacy journey. So I guess either of you can start, but what sparked your journey into climate work, and why did it matter to you personally?
Okay. Oh, this is on. So I'm not quite sure how many of you all remember the Bay Area in September of 2020 when the skies turned orange. I'm not quite sure how old you were. Does everyone here remember that? So I remember being in my room, logging on to freshman year of high school, actually, because it was the start of the pandemic. And I remember I was stuck in this endless cycle of gloom and doom, watching planetary collapse through my cell phone. And I felt so disempowered, so much like I lacked any agency to act on the climate crisis. But then that morning, I looked out my window and all of a sudden, climate disaster was at my doorstep. The skies were turned completely orange. There was so much ash and soot and particulate matter in the air that literally the act of walking outside made you want to start coughing. And for me, that was really the turning point, because I realized that this is the future that our generation is inheriting if we don't take the steps and the necessary measures that we can right now to battle this emergency. I remember finding myself, I was in a Target parking lot handing out N95 masks to folks who were more directly affected by the flames. And I realized that the government and the state was not prepared to handle the sheer level of severity and urgency that these climate disasters demand of us. So that was really my wake-up call, and from there, I haven't stopped organizing ever since. And, you know, it's definitely scary that these events are occurring to us. And at the same time, I think that seeing the impacts of the climate crisis so boldly and visibly is a jarring experience enough to spur many into action.
Yeah, I think that's a really great story, especially because it brings you to the visceral moment of how you are experiencing the impact of climate. I think for me, when I was in high school, which is quite a few years back, I remember for one in class, I had to write a blog about climate change. Like, that was the assignment. And I remember I was seeing news about small island countries like Tuvalu and Kiribati, and that they were very low-lying. And one of the big consequences of climate change is sea level rise, and it rises faster in areas where, of course, it's like land subsidence, but especially if your elevation of your country is already very low, you need to find a solution in terms of maybe involving moving your entire population to another country. So I think from that time onwards, it was something that was shocking to put my head around, the fact that there are entire countries at risk because of climate change, and also the unfairness of it, where most of the emissions that caused climate change were coming from advanced economies. And so how to address that challenge on this global scale of very unevenly distributed responsibilities, and the consequences being felt by the most vulnerable population. So I think that was my draw into climate, and maybe I'll stop there. I'll talk about the rest of my life in other questions.
Nice. Yeah, you guys both had such powerful responses. And yeah, like looking back to when you first got involved with advocacy, like what's one thing that you wish you had known as a younger person, like getting involved, learning more about the movement, and like being pushed to do something?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think for me, you know, no one teaches you how to be an organizer or an advocate or an activist. But I think that I wish I had known that the brunt of this crisis, the weight of this crisis, doesn't only fall on the shoulders of young people. And that's a very broad answer, but I think oftentimes when you're young and you get involved in this work, it can really feel like, especially if you're operating on the local level, that all of a sudden you are inheriting so much responsibility. And I think that in a lot of ways, the climate crisis has stolen a lot of my childhood. You know, I rather would have been playing outside or going to a party or spending time with my friends doing things that didn't necessarily have to revolve around holding policymakers and adults accountable. So I think remembering that we need to build more intergenerational coalitions where young people are not just operating in underfunded silos where they have to do all of the work alone, but really leaning more into support systems that involve teachers and, you know, local representatives and parents, and something that really is more collaborative and less siloed and put onto the shoulders of young people.
Yeah, I think organizing for me has been a way to address individual climate anxieties. So I think when I think about organizing, first of all, like it's motivated by a lot of hope. And that hope comes from the belief that what we can do collectively, either demanding change or providing resources with each other and support for each other, that can help literally shape the future in the trajectory that you want it to be. And I think there's an incredibly empowering aspect of that, because it means you're not just taking your own future into your hands. There might be some constraints that you face on an individual level, but if you're organized in the collective way and you realize that you're all sharing the same values and you realize you want the same set of changes in the structure or a policy that you're facing as a constraint, you can literally organize to change that together and prevent other individuals who might experience those things as an individual barrier. So I think there's a very empowering aspect that drew me to organizing. And during my time at Stanford, I've learned that there are actual different ways of conceptualizing power and different ways of structuring your strategy. How do you think about a campaign? How do you respond to challenge? There are a lot of organizers out there who have thought about this a lot. And if they hadn't done the work that they did, the world would be in a very different place today. So I think that all of that gives me hope, and that's what keeps me in organizing.
Could I just add on to that too? Because I really resonate with that response. To speak in terms of my personal experience, and also for many of the other youth and friends that I've organized with, I feel that organizing gives us a stake in the future. Oftentimes these problems like climate change and, environmental crises, they feel so big and so much like the ability to make an impact is so out of touch with our realities, since it feels like oftentimes the folks who hold stake in the future are presidents and UN officials and people in fancy air-conditioned, policy rooms. But actually organizing allows us to give ourselves a stake in that future. And that can look like, building power on the street, creating a workshop, or even hosting a strike or anything that has to do with bringing people together.
Yeah, and I guess adding on to that, in terms of education, where do you all see climate advocacy having a place in that? How can storytelling help shift climate attitudes, or how can you use education and storytelling to further your advocacy?
Yeah, so I can start with this one. So storytelling, I think a part of me always knew the power of storytelling in organizing. I formally learned what that framework could look like during my time at Stanford. So actually the keynote speaker who was here, Chris and Brianna, they've also gone through the same type of framework training. It's called Public Narrative, which is a framework that was developed by Marshall Gans, who was an organizer here back in the day with the farm workers. And core to the storytelling framework is the shared values and how you connect with your audience on a shared value. And the way to bring out that value is telling a very personal story about a time you were vulnerable, met a challenge, and how you overcame that. And all of those elements together narrate, I'm sharing my personal story and a challenge that I overcame, and here was my source of hope. And by connecting on that emotional level, which is best told through a story, you can connect with fellow organizers who might be feeling the same way, who are maybe feeling isolated because they don't know that others have been feeling the same way too. So yeah, I'll stop there, but storytelling, I think, is really a fundamental piece of organizing, especially to create an empathetic bridge with who you want to build power with.
Love that answer. Before I get into my response, I would love to actually give y'all an activity to do for a second, especially when it comes to this topic of education and climate communication. If you can, take out your phones and just Google climate change, and then go to images, and I'm gonna ask y'all to tell me what you see. So are we all on images under the term climate change? Okay. Tell me, does anyone feel comfortable sharing? Just name some of the descriptions of the images that you see. Yeah, go ahead.
I see a lot of pictures of, well, there's a picture of a polar bear standing on a melting ice cap here. There's pictures of various disasters, fires, tornadoes. There's a picture with the, on one side, the earth is green and lush. On the other side, it's brown and dark, which is very disturbing. There's a picture.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Pictures of Earth next to thermometers, that sort of thing.
Any other? Let's take one more.
When I was looking, it showed like pictures of other people in countries that are not as fortunate, because like, you know, like climate change like affects a lot in other countries like Jamaica and like a lot of parts in Africa and stuff, and like it just shows how vulnerable they are to our like things that we're causing, you know.
Yeah. So thank you for all engaging in that little activity. So as you were mentioning, we see photos of the first hits on Google that come up for the term climate change are polar bears, AI generated photos of weird Earths where half of it is on fire and half of it is green and lush, and photos of flames and hurricanes and just very bold, graphic, almost kind of animated imagery. And this right here is exactly why the climate crisis is a crisis of communication. This is why our educational systems, I think, have been failing us. Because for working people across America, for young people, you know, we obviously care about polar bears. They're cute and they're fuzzy, but what does this actually have to do with our daily lives? How does that actually spur us into action? So these are the questions that I find myself grappling with, and a lot of other folks who work in the educational space, is how can we reframe and change the narrative and the images and the tropes that we're using to talk about climate change in a way that relates more to our daily lives? And that's why I think it's so important to focus on stories that are rooted in emotion and are rooted in people's realities. You know, how can we start talking about stories that have to do with our everyday lives? Like, for instance, I recently just wrote an op-ed for Teen Vogue that basically chronicles how there's this tension between my work as a climate organizer and my dad as an airline pilot, because this is a seemingly very different, you know, field. And at the same time, my dad is part of a global labor force that is connected to the fossil fuel industry and, you know, is oftentimes villainized for the climate crisis, but he's a pawn in a system where there's CEOs making millions of dollars. So when we start to interrogate the failures of climate messaging, I think that's really when we can engage more folks and new audiences that have felt kind of left behind by this imagery of just like polar bears and AI Earths on fire. So yeah, that is a very, I think, visible failure in terms of education that we really should be, you know, holding folks accountable to.
Yeah, I guess I have a follow-up to that. I was wondering, like, both of you are definitely saying that it's really important to have more personal messaging and more relatable messaging for just the everyday person. So I guess what are some examples of successful messaging that you've seen, or like do you have any examples of stories that you feel really speak to a lot of people's everyday lives and whatnot? Yeah, just wondering.
Wow. I can't think of like one specific story in particular at the moment, but if I use an example of like in class, the things people would use to communicate climate anxiety, some of them can feel like it comes from the call to action on climate can come from a very different set of challenges and circumstances you've experienced in your own life. So for me, it was memories of being an immigrant in Indiana and knowing what it feels like if you don't feel represented in a group, feeling like you're part of an other because of an arbitrary reason, because you don't speak the same language or you look a little bit different or things like that. And so the values that I learned from those types of challenges still speak to the challenge of climate change, because it is ultimately about how do we work together while paying attention to the fact that a lot of the consequences of climate change have been concentrated in parts of the world where we might be more likely to ignore or not be aware of. So how do you raise awareness at that global scale? But the values that drive me to do this work today is still rooted in those experiences of racism that you might have experienced, because the underlying values are the same. You want justice against arbitrary power is like the overarching theme. But I hope that gives a good example of how a story that's very personal and may seem like a very disconnected issue can be the very same values and emotions that lead you to do climate work.
Do you remind, like, can you repeat the question again?
Oh yeah. I guess, I don't know, I was just wondering, like, what are some examples of successful messaging that you've seen, or any successful, like, personal stories that people have shared that,
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I really resonate with your answer around values and looking at belonging and how folks' identities and like our struggles are oftentimes very much tied and bound up in the climate crisis. I think in terms of messaging, one thing I know that I have done that I feel like has been very successful, especially in engaging young people, I spent my 4 years of high school organizing other high schoolers for climate justice in the Bay Area. So co-chairing the Bay Area Youth Climate Summit for me gave us the opportunity to really make climate something that is inclusive, not something where you have to be only interested in trees and plants or gardening or hardcore science to get involved in. So I think in terms of messaging, it's really great when we can frame climate as something that involves everyone, as something that can be connected to anything from engineering to art to agriculture to architecture, all the way to computer science even. Because the climate crisis affects all of us, and there are literally, I think, an infinite number of solutions that we can drive in all of our different fields of interest to solve the challenge that I really think is the greatest struggle of our time. Now, I'll just add on one thing too when it comes to messaging. I think that there has to be a balance of focus on solutions and hope and optimism while also reality. And I think folks can sometimes feel that when we're only talking about the endless doom and gloom and everything that is a problem, why would we want to be involved in this for the long run? Which is why there are courses, like for instance, one that I co-lecture for, that really focus on solutions and small steps that we can all take.
Thank you for, I just kind of threw that question at you, but yeah, you guys had really interesting responses. I guess kind of looking towards the future, and both of you are talking about how hope is really important to have. in the fight and in advocacy, like what are some ways that, especially as youth, like this is a very existential issue for us because we will be the ones like inheriting this problem and having to deal with this when we grow up, and it will only compound over time. So what are some ways that youth audiences can handle climate anxiety, and also like what personally brings you hope in the fight as well?
I'll let you mull more on that one. I think that what's specific to youth, I would try to think about this on my drive here, and I didn't have a clear answer, and maybe that's not satisfactory. But I think the one dominant theme is that the youth voice is a powerful driver in keeping whoever is doing the research or making policy decisions accountable. And I'm sure you hear something like this a lot, but I think if that were gone, a lot of the questions that are being thrown around in the UN at COP, a lot of those questions wouldn't have the same level of urgency. And so I think one part of it is keep asking the questions, keep organizing so that your voice can be louder, so it's not scattered. You can be more powerful together. So like, I think keep asking the questions and keep identifying the tensions that you find in your real life so that it becomes more of a real problem to people who are trying to address it on a policy stage. In terms of hope, I think it might also be a little bit trite to say, like, everyone says, oh, my hope is the youth, like, who are organizing now. And then one person was like, well, then one youth said, well, then if I give you hope, then what are you doing in response? Like, you just see that we're active on the streets and talking about this in a loud way, and that gives you hope, but so what is happening in response? And so I think the question, where do we go from here, is kind of, so as you move on into your college degrees and you think about what you're going to study, how you want to contribute to climate, I think there are so many different ways you can contribute. But just keeping in mind, like, what is the change that you're asking for, and how can you make that demand for change be not acceptable to ignore? And I think there are multiple different campaigns and strategies, and everything will be context dependent. But just keeping on to that hope that whatever field you end up going into, you still have the power to organize and change the future that you want to live in. So I think, like, being creative is a key part of it. Keep asking questions and know that whatever field you're in, this is something you can continue to do.
Thank you for this question, because how many of us have felt guilt for the climate crisis in this room? How many of us has felt that humans and everyday people are completely at fault for driving a car? How many times have you felt that your carbon footprint is causing the climate crisis? How many times have you had to calculate your carbon footprint in, like, a class? Does that happen to y'all? Okay, so when it comes to this question of hope, I think, again, it's a problem of our messaging, because fear, guilt, blame, and shame don't work as drivers of action. They don't spur people into urgency. They don't make people want to act. They make us want to shut down. So it's really important that we actually are leaning into hope and optimism and community, and at the same time being real about the fact that the climate crisis is an extreme existential threat to our future. And I also want to talk about hope for a second, because as you were saying, hope is something that is often thrown around. It's a question that adults love to ask young people. They like to take our hope and use it to, I don't know, make themselves feel better about the climate crisis. But hope is not something that is given. Hope is earned. Hope looks like going into the streets, organizing a strike, organizing a rally, holding polluters accountable. Hope is something that is generated in community. It's not something that you are given from the top and passed down to, which is why I really wanted to plug actually something that is happening locally within our state and that a lot of organizers and different coalitions are fighting for. And that is this bill to make polluters pay. And I think when it comes to young people and our future, we have to be clear about who the villains are. The fossil fuel industry and our government has been lying to us for 40, 50 years about the facts. They have literally stolen time from our lives because they hid the evidence of global warming. So now in 2025, we are dealing with the crisis. LA burned to the ground because of the fossil fuel industry. So this bill to make polluters pay is something that we can all advocate for. You can call your representatives and even join the Sunrise Movement's local hub in this rally on Sunday. And I can give more info about that too. And we're also tabling here. So there's plenty of chances to learn about how you can get involved.
Can I say one quick thing? For the source of hope, I also wanted to add, in addition to organizing opportunities with great organizations, to focus on the things that did change as a result of organizing. So for instance, like small policy changes, you can't really start with the biggest change that you want to ask, but if you nest it, you can, for example, at Stanford, I've seen how policy has changed or certain programs have really changed the way they operate because of the organizing work. And so I think it's really important to keep in mind the small wins that come, because it's the great revolution and structural change that's really hard, and that actually can come in increments. And I think it's really important to pay attention when you have those small wins and celebrate those, because ultimately the bigger change can build on each of those small wins. So, and having seen that's what gives me hope. I have seen change in a big institution, even at Stanford. So,
yeah, thank you for your responses. Yeah, those were really, really powerful. I think now it is time for our youth Q&A. So if any of you all have questions that you'd like to ask, now is the time. Yeah. And if you have a question, just raise your hand and we will have a mic passed around to you. Yeah.
Then that became like my identity and like dealing with that, and then I gained all that weight like back, and then have recently like lost a lot of it again, and just like fluctuating through that. Often we don't necessarily always see those things as within the scope of like eating disorders or these kinds of things. We even see them glorified on social media as like body transformations. Like look at that, look at how like ripped they got, how much their body changed. But those things are like really significantly challenging to process. So I'd echo Chris's point that like it is great to get help.
It's coming from a different.
What number is that? What number is it? 5. Okay.
You know what? Just speak loudly. Yes. Yes.
I'm wondering, like, do you think environmental conscious is like a first world privilege?
Yeah, so I guess this relates to the question of being more eco-conscious tends to be expensive. So I think in certain senses, from as a consumer standpoint, trying to be more environmentally conscious can feel like it comes at a cost. And I think it's dependent on each individual how they make these decisions. So everyone can be conscious at a level that they can afford, and embedded within their context, right? But it's also I think there is a layer of myth to the fact that it's your individual carbon footprint that's at the root cause. There are policies and legal structures that have been designed to maybe put the more fossil fuel emissions intensive products more easily accessible to you. So those are probably changes that you can't change based on your individual consumer decisions. So yes, some of these products can feel like it comes at a premium, but there are also other ways of lifestyle choices you can make. Like we heard of one from the audience, but I think there's a certain limit to what you can make on an individual scale, and I would say there are a lot of broader scale changes that you can organize for that doesn't entail that like price tag on how you are choosing to be environmentally conscious.
I can also add on to that to say that, I think living in the global north, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and I think it is a privilege, but folks in the global north kind of have to work twice as hard to be sustainable, because folks in the global south are already living lives that are inherently more regenerative. And I think there's this tension between wanting to improve people's lives to live more leisurely, like we do here in westernized countries, and also the very real need to adopt practices that are more regenerative, where there's upcycling and shared resources and local gift-giving economies where goods are shared. So I think that in terms of this question, though, of privilege, when it comes to spending time thinking about our eco-anxiety or our climate anxiety, I do think that is a privileged thing. And I think that there's no blaming and shame and guilt that we need to do to each other because we have those feelings. And also the reality is, for the majority of people, they're just struggling to make ends meet and to put food on the table. So thinking about what ifs around climate disaster are, for some people, I think, not something they have the time to actually sit there and put energy into.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you oh wow. Okay, so thank you for talking about what gives you hope, but I think I do agree with you in terms of a lot of the action that we take has to come from like communication and messaging, but I also think that it doesn't mean anything without real action. So for example, what gives me hope is I see like a lot of collective action from around the world, a lot of interdisciplinary innovation when it comes to technology and finding new ways to, for example, renewable energy. I just recently saw a project about how people can use biofuel to actually create more renewable sources of energy. So there's a lot of biochemistry, a lot of physics and engineering that are closely related. But I think successful messaging could really only come with like various types of innovation. Like I know there are a lot of rewilding projects from around the world. For example, in Slovenia, there's a huge project with flooding of the Danube. There's some huge ones about like coral in Indonesia. So I just want to know what you think about that and how we can support those projects besides just donating, because as you said earlier, like it's important for us to find a way where like everybody can get involved.
Yeah, just taking a first stab. I think there are ways, like the polluter pays bill. There's bills like that take a lot of effort and organizing to actually get the people who can vote to get that passed to realize that it is a real issue for their constituents and they think that it really matters. So Also big infrastructure projects or budget plans, like how a local or central government decides to allocate its resources. Are they going to provide more subsidies to fossil fuels to keep energy cheap, or are they going to try to build out a large scale, utility scale renewable energy, upgrade the grid so that more renewable can power the grid? So all of these decisions ultimately, like, I would say if it comes down to specific bills that will ensure that more of these projects can take place, I think that's a great place for organizing to make sure that those bills get passed. That's my first stab for now.
Yeah, I think that it's a complicated question. And when it comes to solving the climate crisis and to activating people, I don't think it's necessarily an either or, where either we put all of our energy into infrastructure and endless advocacy and action, or we put our energy into messaging and shifting public perception. I think it exists on a spectrum where we need folks in every single field, in every single sector, in every workplace, battling the climate crisis and trying to move ourselves away from fossil fuels in every way that they can. So also to answer your quick question about how can we support these projects beyond just donating, I think oftentimes people think that the best way to address our ecological emergencies to go just give money to a Amazon forest restoration fund. And I think that, okay, if you have a lot of money, if you're Jeff Bezos, then maybe sure, that's helpful. But the impacts of the climate crisis are going to be felt everywhere. And there are folks in our community who spend every single day organizing. So finding like a local group or a local hub to be a part of is a great way to give yourself a stake in that future.
And I had one last question just from, I guess, myself. We have around 2-ish minutes. But yeah, like I guess under the current administration and even the past administration too, I feel like there hasn't been as much prioritization when it comes to the climate crisis, definitely. And yeah, so I guess how do we move forward under a government and an administration that we feel is so hostile towards like any addressing or anyone bringing up climate related issues?
I knew there would be a question like this also coming up. I was thinking about it, and I think to end on a note of so where do we go from here? You might every day you see the news and something wild is happening, and it's creating a lot of uncertainty and along with it a lot of anxiety. It's some of it is targeting specific groups of people, and I think when I try to think specifically about what's happening in universities, I had a lot of hope on Monday when Harvard made a decision to say we're not going to accept some of these demands. It goes against our principles. So I think it's troubled times, but I think always during chaos, that's always an opportunity to sharpen principles and values and reevaluate why some of the things were able to occur and like maybe reestablish a new contract with how universities should be in partnership with government. So I'm trying to see the silver lining in this because otherwise it's just wild, the day-to-day swings that are happening. But in the midst of that, you see people who are trying to say, okay, we're addressing this in a very principled manner. This is a red line, and these are terms we will absolutely not accept, and we want to shape things in this way. And how to communicate that, so it's another communication, but also we need to make sure that we can put our voice and our weight behind people who are able to do that in a very public way. So yeah, I think there can be many silver linings that come from this.
I will add on to that to say that understand that this is a very important time. This is a very revealing time. What our country is going through right now is, I think, one of the most clarifying moments in an invitation for us as a country and as citizens to really think about what our values are. Because a lot of people who voted for the current administration are not actually seeing what they thought they voted for occur. The firing of tens of thousands of federal workers, the gutting of our clean air and water, and the decisions to allow raw sewage back into our drinking water is not something that Americans actually want. So in this moment, in the uncertainty, I think that we can find unity because people are starting to put the pieces together and understand that the billionaire and the elite class derives their power from driving working people apart. For too long, they have used distractions around identity politics, around whether a trans person in Maine can play soccer or not, to distract us from the reality that we are living through class struggle. We're living in, as Bernie Sanders and AOC has said, an oligarchy, where there is the 1% with billions and billions of dollars, and the 99%, which is the majority of all of us, living through a very difficult time. So without going deeper into the question, because I think there's a lot of feelings that we're all experiencing right now, I think we have to remember that there is a lot of power that we as people, as a really mass movement, holds outside of the systems that are collapsing around us.
Yeah, that's a very, very powerful note to end on. So thank you so much to our speakers, and